Thank you, Mindy. It's a pleasure to be here. And first of all, I want to start by being rude to one of the previous speakers. Maurice made a comment about the cost at 6 degrees centigrade, 40, 50 trillion. I think you'd have to be an insurance company to get there. At 6 degrees, I give you my personal guarantee in 50 years, we will have nothing approaching a stable global society. Everything we value will have pretty well disintegrated. And if I'm not right, I'll buy you dinner. Second, my credentials. In March, 50 years ago, I got my first job at Keystone Funds that had 1.6 billion under management, just behind Fidelity that had 1.7. Fidelity turned me down. And in 1971, I recommended commercial indexing because it was a zero-sum game, not because the market was inefficient, which it clearly was not back then. We shared the business with Wells Fargo, and we were several years ahead of Vanguard, yes. And in climate change, I think it's fair to say I'm all in. 95% of my net worth is in the Grantham Foundation for the Protection of the Environment, and our ambition is pretty simple: to save as much of the environment as we can and to punch above our weight. At GMO, I've had no line responsibility for 15 years or so. My job is writing and propaganda and helping out in our new climate change fund. 75% of the work that I do is still on finance, 25% is on the environment and deficiencies in capitalism and democracy. This is the ratio, 75-25, that seems reasonable to my partners who own 83% of GMO to my 17. So you see, even an old fogey with his name on the door gets to have career risk. Career risk is the dominating force for almost everyone. In investing, it's what causes institutions to be overly diversified. When only one asset class, emerging markets, is very cheap. Why do they do this? Because it's normal. It's done by everyone. And failing collectively is risk-free to your career, as Keynes pointed out in 1936, while to be unusual is to risk your career completely. Career risk is why senior executives in ordinary firms do not push hard on the policies on climate change factors of their employers, but go along with the generally accepted line, which creeps forward far too slowly. It is pushed by NGOs like Mindy's, by some governments, and even state and local governments, by some consumers, but only by quite a few dozen corporate officers, far too many of whom are here. Career risk is why good people in the fossil fuel industry don't object vigorously to their companies' funding of climate denial and general obfuscation, even though they, as engineers and scientists, know perfectly well the extreme risks of climate change. They act, as do all the officers of their companies, as if they have no children or grandchildren. They keep their noses clean. They just go along. They are, after all, just following orders. Let me tell you a story about capitalism. It famously drives thousands of things better than command economies. And I agree. But it does a handful of things badly or not at all, any one of which can bring us to our knees. Above all, it does not handle the tragedies of the commons: water, soil, and air. We have an exceptionally watery planet, It recycles itself, for heaven's sake. It begs to be helpful, yet we're short of water everywhere and we pollute it everywhere. We've treated the air like an open sewer. On these topics, corporations and others need regulation, however distasteful regulation may be to libertarians and others. But it is soil that I worry about most. We have in the US lost half our soil since World War II. Globally, we have permanently lost about 1/3 of our arable land over 12,000 years of often incompetent farming. We now continue to lose globally about 1% of our soil a year. You don't have to be a PhD in mathematics to work that one out. We only have about 30 to 100 years of good crops left, depending on where you are. Although our arable soil in the US and most places is owned exclusively by individuals and firms, the soil is our collective commons. When it's gone, we're all gone. So now my story of the farmer and the devil. The devil goes to a farmer in the Midwest and says, "Boy, do I have a deal for you. I am going to guarantee that you make 3 times the profit you would otherwise have made if you signed this contract." Clause 1, of course, is his soul. But clause 25 is his soil. He must lose 1% a year of his soil. And that's about the rate at which he's losing it today. And of course, this 50-year contract is signed eagerly. And at the end of the 50 years, the grandchildren gather, the devil comes back, all the locals are there, having admired the wealth production of that particular farm, and the grandchildren re-up for another 50 years, as do all the locals. And let me say this, they still have half their soil in 50 years in the Midwest. It's still enough to get a pretty good harvest, and at 3 times your profit. That is the right capitalist decision to make. There is no MBA that I bumped into who would not sign that contract. It's just good capitalism. And at least at the end of the second contract, or slightly before, when the starving crowds arrive from Chicago, the farmers die rich. No one has ever objected to the logic that I just laid out. It is absolutely impeccable. Capitalism simply cannot deal with these long horizon social events. Because of the focus on short-term profits and maximizing and the lack of enlightenment in general, we may well have created a generally toxic environment. So toxic that it turns out several months ago, to everyone's shock and horror, they discovered that 75% of all flying insects were missing. And they did this in Germany, in German forests, not on the edge of some refinery. 75% of all flying insects. We knew that the things we have studied, like bees and monarch butterflies, were in distress. Never doubt, by the way, the rigor of Germans in forests. They're very good. The bad news is that this was all written up in the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, not some podunky journal, even though very few of you here will have heard of it. What it suggests is that the general environment is not conducive to nature and living things as we know them. Our sperm count is down to 50%, and no one is concerned. I wonder if they'll be concerned at 75. How about 87.5? It may be that none of us are really healthy in the world we've created. You've not heard, by the way, enough or maybe anything at all about population growth and its huge effect on future climate change. Emigration as well, and failing state pressures, particularly in Africa. Why not? Because it's politically incorrect in the extreme to mention this topic. And now I've not nearly enough time to go through all my exhibits, which are a primer for those who took too many coffee breaks today. But a few are very important, I think, so I'll race through and cover 3 or 4 in some detail. And first, let me add that GMO's Climate Change Fund is designed to make money by understanding the rapidly changing scene faster than most. We do not expect this to be a sacrifice of return, quite the reverse. Our portfolio sells at market PEs, seems more inefficiently priced, and of course avoids fossil fuels that face a very difficult future. As always, you have to worry about hype and to be sensitive about price. Let me say that my original talk I gave last night at dinner, and so I was so bored I couldn't repeat it, so I had to write out a new one. Hence the notes, please forgive me. Now I'm going to try and follow my notes over the top of my head, my slides. Okay, the race of our lives. First, an important tangent, a myth about diversification. This is now my favorite exhibit. It takes 10%, a big 10% sector, out of the market in red in the S&P, 9.7% for 35 years, and you see what you get in 10 groups if you rigorously only have the remaining 90% all the time. You're not messing with your portfolio, you're doing one thing consistently, you're taking out one big group. It doesn't matter whether it's energy or drugs or finance, it makes no darn difference. When I saw this, I couldn't believe it. I thought, my God, I picked the most lucky starting point. So I went with it anyway, because I'm sneaky like that. And then over the following months, my conscience nagged me, and so we backed it up all the way back to 1925, and the remarkably narrow range of 50 bips went to 54 bips. There's one thing that this market can do efficiently, and that is understand that technology is sexy, utilities are not, and price them so that you get the same. You cannot expect to be paid more in a broad industry sector than another one. And it gets it right. If you want to divest fossil fuels or drugs or any major group, not a single stock like Amazon, but a major group, your starting assumption is that you will get about the right return, about the same return, plus or minus nothing. Every committee you've ever talked to tells you that if you cough, you will ruin the portfolio return. There's nothing on the planet more conservative than an investment committee, and I have met hundreds. And it's just not true. And if you have an axe to grind that fossil fuels have a dismal future, you have 2 darn good reasons to get rid of them. Okay, the race of our life accelerates. Everything is accelerating. The carbon dioxide ebb and flow over the last 400,000 years has been 120 bips per million, parts per million. The difference between an ice age and an interglacial is 120 parts per million, ebbing and flowing, 4 ice ages. You get to 1950, and you're in handsomely at the top end of the range in an interglacial, and then you add 125. We will be dead lucky if we don't add another 120 before we're finished. We are engaged in a very brave experiment that actually can only be adequately described as feckless, a lovely word, not serious, lacking maturity, perspective, and information. The surface temperature is accelerating, a word I couldn't get the scientists to spit out until Trump was elected, and now they do. They've become quite brave. The air temperature was rising at 7 bips a year, and now 15, with the recent comparisons at 25 between the 2 warm events caused by El Niños. The ocean temperature is accelerating. Whoops, have I made a mistake there? The ocean temperatures are doing the same. Before 1990, 37 heating units per year afterwards 99. These are 2 to 3 times the rate. Ice is, of course, the worst of all, melting more than 2 to 3 times, 3 to 4 times faster than it used to. That's why, as our president says, we have more ice everywhere than ever before. To say such a thing with confidence and be so ignorant is to suggest that he's totally lacking in judgment and, I think, intelligence, or he's incredibly cynical. You can take your pick. They are both extremely dangerous. Let's try and get that one on my finger. Okay. The consequences of a warming climate, the most consistent one is extra heavy downpours. As you can see, the incidence of heavy downpours rising across the page. In the UK, a recent report about a year ago said that British summers by 2100 would have 4 times the heavy downpours, which, as you all know, is just what the English summer needs. The consequences of heavy downpour are much worse than you think because they play a very big role in erosion. You can't grow food without soil. It's only the heavy 2 or 3 days a year, it's a power law, that erodes. And once or twice every year or two, so heavily that you have 10-foot gullies in the Midwest. It is precisely those heavy, erosive downpours that are increasing. The serious, widespread consequences are everywhere: floods, droughts, extreme temperature, wildfires. You read about them, you see them, and that is just a quick tally. The good news, on the other hand, in the race of our lives, is that climate is offset by technology also accelerating. I think this room full of people accepted far more than is understood by a typical, let's say, Bostonian businessman. This is the bottom line from the horse's mouth. The president of the largest utility company in America: new wind and solar without incentives and combined with storage are going to be cheaper than the marginal operating cost of coal and nuclear in the next decade. Of course, it will transform everything. And everybody is behind the game because last week the bids in Colorado were made public, and they bid for 2023 wind plus storage, unfortunately unspecified, could not be dug out anywhere. Wind plus storage, 21 cents. The low coal is 40 on a marginal cost basis, and the high is 60, as you see here. That's actually the average is a little under 60. The marginal low cost is 40, and now much lower even than this chart. Wind plus storage, 21, solar plus storage, 36. Unexpectedly above wind, but still below the marginal cost of soil. And this is what is going on. Oh dear. Oh well, you're smart, you can follow. This is what's going on in wind. Again, one of my favorite exhibits. Since 2000, we've gone from toys to monsters, from 2 megawatt to 10, and we know for a fact now that they are building, under contract, 12 megawatts, and under research for way up to 25. And one day, to my utter amazement, offshore wind assembled on the coast, put on a ship, sent out there, and erected in less than a day, will be the cheapest form of energy on the planet, unless we get extremely lucky in a new form of nuclear. You cannot build those monsters on land. You can't move the pieces around. They're simply too big. The 12 megawatt ones are as high as the Eiffel Tower, and the 25 ones, forget about it. They're just gigantic. You service them by landing a helicopter very quickly on the top of each one. Battery costs you know very well about, dropping like a stone, and research on solid state. Darn it, my own, so I'm running out of time. Stop. Energy to peak, this is a very aggressive renewables, and yet you can see that by 2050, it is sadly still 50% fossil fuels, which gives us this one. The fossil fuel use peaks heroically early on the aggressive assumptions I'm making, but carbon emissions continue to rise, giving you this one, sadly, the near guarantee that we can't get under 2 degrees centigrade. The best we could hope for is it will just be under by 2050. Of course, massive quantities of money are needed, over 2 trillion. The energy efficiency continues to accelerate and absolutely must. And now, the final section, now the terrible news. So the environment is accelerating on the downside, the worst side. The technology is trying to race to the rescue, but this is actually the real problem. The population, when you see a chart like that in the stock market, you panic automatically. Growing very, very slowly, 1.5 billion with Malthus, little under 2 billion when I was born. It's now 7.5, 3.5 times in my life. I mean, just extrapolate that for a second and you'll know it's chaos. And looking forward, we have a low of 7.5 to 8, which we could just about handle maybe, and most likely of 10.5, which would be a dreadful problem given our food problems, and 16 on the upside, which doesn't bear thinking about. Fortunately, we have things that Malthus didn't even dream about. Iranian women had 7 children in 1961, on average each, and now they have 1.5, 1.6. Bangladesh, also dirt poor and Muslim, are down to 2.2, just with a good government approach. Other countries, as you can see, in all doing pretty darn well. The real problem, sadly, is Africa, where in many countries, it's not that you need 8 farmers, the old Indian story, it's that it's simply considered the right behavior for a good man to have 7 children. In Nigeria, they aspire to 7 children and have almost 6. In Nigeria, the official UN forecast is that they will add 600 million people. As it turns out, all of them want to emigrate to the UK. 40% of them want to emigrate, which makes it pretty tough in a little island if 40% of 600 million want to emigrate. 3.3 extra billion Africans by 2100, and that is the official forecast. Of course, it will not happen. Total food demand, of course, is rising relentlessly. And how are we going to meet it? I had to choose between standing up and seeing my slides. I took standing up, which isn't an entirely good idea. From the Green Revolution, we were growing productivity of grain at 3.5%. It's now down to about 1.1. This is a little out of date. And the average population growth has happily come down from 2.1 to about 1. They're in a dead heat. There is no room for things to go wrong with grain productivity that does the heavy lifting in calories. And everything is going wrong. This is the productivity of the best grain growing places in the world. Wheat in France, Germany, rice in Japan. They have all flattened off in the last 15 years to approximately nothing. You cannot get blood out of a stone. The other thing is fertilizer, which was the backbone of the agricultural revolution, the Green Revolution. It wasn't just that they produced more, you had to fertilize them and they could absorb it. We went up to 5 times and now we've maxed out. China and the US are 2 big countries that actually provably use more fertilizer than is optimal. Back to erosion, this is the cost that is believed to be coming, a 10% reduction as the soil gets thinner. Bear in mind, when it's gone, it's a whole lot worse. And this is a nice photograph of a town in the middle of Iowa who kept a record in 1850 of 14 inches of soil, which has steadily gone down to 5.5. In this case, they've lost considerably more than 50%. But this is the killer I talked about. This is the effect of climate change. What these guys did is they went back into the data and they teased apart the actual effect in America of previous floods and droughts by area over the last 40 years and the effect of temperature, which was very modest. It's only in the last few years that temperatures get high enough to have a negative effect. And then they extrapolated the steady increases in floods and droughts, which are killers, and this is what they came to: a 47% setback from current trends by 2040. And when you add them together, 53. Let me just point out in passing a weakness in science. This wonderful report on climate change does not mention erosion. They live in a world where erosion is not on their radar screen. The report on erosion does not mention the hit from climate change. This is absolutely typical. You're a great student of something and sadly lacking in breadth. Other problems facing big ag, almost finished here: water availability, urban expansion, bug and pathogen immunity. You've all heard about these. The 75% loss of flying insects. When you lose insects, you lose plant life in the end. And fertilizer distribution, because one of my long-established bees in my bonnet, Morocco has 75% of all the high-quality, cheap fertilizer of phosphorus. Without phosphorus, you can grow no living thing. We're 1.5% by body weight. We've done the next couple, leaving me with the conclusions. The summary. 1, our responsibility is to accept more career risk, to push our organizations harder. I will try harder. It's taken me a long time to move our organization even into offering a climate change fund. Second, it's relatively straightforward to protect your portfolios, better than most people do. Concentrate on climate and food problems, and study the new technologies and their disruptive power. It is easy to do that better than others because they really haven't got the point yet. And finally, but we have a far, far more important job for those investment managers who happen to be human, and that is protecting our climate, biodiversity, and food-producing capacity. That is to say, protecting not just our grandchildren, but our species. Thank you.